My name is Kent Lassman. I'm the president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And real quick, things that we all know, but I just want to cover in case there's one of these items that is most interesting to you and you didn't catch it on the way in. Please silence your devices. It's going to help us throughout the morning, throughout the afternoon with the conversation. Secondly, some of you noted, and perhaps even noted with alarm, we have a camera in the back. The purpose here is to help us capture what we're going to learn from this excellent panel. The Q&A will not be recorded, and if you have any concerns about that, just let me know or let one of our staff know. Third, I am not going to do big, long, full introductions of the four men to my left. The material's available to you. I don't think it's particularly going to add to the conversation. I will introduce each of them in turn in just a moment with a sentence or two, and then they will speak from the podium, and we'll do Q&A from the table. But if you need to know more, if you need to get in touch with these folks, if you want to work with them, have them involved with your office or your boss in some way, let us know, and we'll make sure that we can help you get those resources that you need. The way to do that, the most straightforward way, is a quick note to media@cei.org. There's a handful of people around from the staff, any one of whom will be happy to help you. That brings me to my last housekeeping note. There's a variety of people here today. Primarily, you're surrounded by congressional staff. There are a handful of members of the media. We have some folks from the broader policy community, including think tanks and other advocacy organizations that RSVP'd, and I see a couple in the room today. So I think it's always helpful just to know who you're with when we dive into these conversations. And with that, I know I was billed as your moderator today, but that's not the role I'm going to play. I think of it more as being the guide for a conversation. So you'll see me keep time. You'll see me encourage conversation and dialogue. I might even try to get these guys to mix it up a little bit. But you're not going to see me spend a lot of time at this podium haranguing you about all that I believe or that CEI professes. If you want to know about that, we'll spend as much time as you want, and I encourage you to check out all the materials at our website, cei.org. So, why are we here, I think, is probably the central question to kick off. And I have to say I commend each and every one of you. I've been doing work around regulatory law for more than 20 years, and it is hard to put 10 people in a room that will show energy for that topic. However, we're at a very unique and interesting point in history. Regulatory reform broadly has a long bipartisan pedigree. It's one of those good ideas that floats around in every administration. We see announcements, and oftentimes we don't see the rubber hit the road. Regulatory reform is something that I think we all can commend what President Obama was able to get started. He brought a focus to it that had been missing for at least a decade. President Trump has put a great deal of energy behind that in the last week and a half. We've seen a pair of executive orders on this topic. We've seen 18 months of campaign speech on the regulatory state. We've seen any number of nominees who have a long track record of public statements about regulation, the way it should be created, what it should accomplish, and how we should monitor and measure its implementation. So with that, I take a great deal of cheer that Congress has repeatedly brought forth these ideas in different legislative forms, and we see a good deal of traction in the coming months for some of those proposals. So today's panel is genuinely expert. First, we're going to hear from Wayne Cruz. He's at CEI as our Vice President for Policy. He also leads the Technology Policy Program and has been working on these ideas since at least when I met him nearly 2 decades ago. We're all getting old. Sitting to his left is Adam White of the Hoover Institute. Adam's expertise and specialty is where regulatory reform, regulatory policy intersects with the law and litigation. Next to him, we have Professor Pierce with more than 4 decades of work. He's probably the most cited scholar on this who I know personally. I'm looking forward to his discussion and encourage you to engage with him on his proposals, what can work and why those things can work. And finally, we will wrap up the formal presentations, each of which will be in the neighborhood of 5 to 7 minutes, with Jerry Ellig, who's at the Mercatus Center, known to many of you through their Capitol Hill outreach programs, not known to anyone in this room, I believe, except for Jerry, and he might have even forgotten, that the very first federal regulatory filing that I signed under my own name, that I wrote, he peer-reviewed for me in 1997. And I think all of those analysts at the FCC who had to paper through what I had to say about merger review are thankful for it. So I thank each of you now. Wayne, I invite you to the podium to kick us off, and thank you all for being here. Please note the OSHA-compliant cord.
Oh, it's pretty loose. One of us will trip. Yeah, thank you, Kent, and appreciate everybody showing up. Thank you all for coming today. You know, the federal government doesn't merely spend $4 trillion a year. It directs the private sector to spend and otherwise repurpose enormous resources. $19 trillion federal debt aside, when policymakers neglect regulation, they ignore government's primary influence in the economy. Politicians fret about $350 billion corporate income tax, but regulation affects us far more. Businessmen tell pollsters they wouldn't do it again, that their companies couldn't have been created in today's regulatory environment. They give up on job creation. We need to pay attention to that. I've heard it said that poverty doesn't have causes, that it's the default state of mankind. Instead, only wealth and production have causes, and regulatory overreach can derail them. There were 3,800 final regulations passed in 2016, while Congress passed only 211 laws. And those rules appeared in a Federal Register of 97,000 pages, 15,000 pages greater than the prior record. So while we often hear of regulatory uncertainty, the certainty of regulation matters too. Meanwhile, the 2016 OMB report to Congress on regulation showed only 21 rules out of thousands that got OMB reviewed cost and benefit analysis, less than 1% of the flow. The 800-pound gorilla, independent agencies get no scrutiny, for example. So for most rules, we don't have third-party vetted cost-benefit analysis, we have agency selfies. And when government steers the economy while the market merely rose, it creates mounting costs even if no further rules get issued, such as agencies' delivery of the internet, and last summer, drones into century-old public utility models. I don't believe members of either party wish to go to the mat maintaining regulation that overreaches, and I hope members and both Democratic and Republican staffers will think through some North Star goals together. I understand partisanship and tribal intensity. I used to work up here. But if you're a Democratic staffer skeptical of regulation of Uber, or of Airbnb, or of drones, or of driverless cars, or of privacy rules from the same federal government housing the NSA, then think about what you might have in common with Republican staffers concerned with environmental overreach and land use restrictions. There's several moving parts in the current landscape. President Trump implemented a moratorium last week and a 2-for-1 order with a regulatory budget this week. At this very moment, a handful of Obama rules are being subjected to resolutions of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act. Meanwhile, the 115th Congress already passed 3 main bills. First, the REINS Act to require Congress to approve the biggest rules. Second, the Midnight Rules Relief Act to bundle resolutions of disapproval so we can do more than 5. And finally, the Regulatory Accountability Act. Of these, the Regulatory Accountability Act looks as though it may emerge as the main negotiating vehicle. It recognizes that the Administrative Procedure Act poses no real barrier to regulatory growth anymore. Alongside regulations, there are thousands of sub-regulatory guidance documents, memoranda, notices, circulars, bulletins, and so forth that we've taken to calling regulatory dark matter. Your bosses, both Democrat and Republican, have come to see unbridled guidance as a concern, so you have an opportunity to achieve something important here together. For example, in hearings by Senators Lankford and Heitkamp, members fretted that the internal process by which an agency decides to issue a guidance document on the one hand or go through an ordinary rulemaking on the other is a black box. Guidance is especially worrisome when notice and comment procedures or OMB review of even ordinary rules is already lacking. I've taken a partial inventory of at least 617 economically significant guidance documents in effect, but thousands of secondary guidances exist. In the financial sector alone, the St. Louis Fed lists 136 pieces of significant guidance across financial agencies, while the Conference of State Bank Supervisors points to over 2,200 so-called directives. Prominent examples of guidance includes infamous Labor Department directives, one on independent contracting, and another on joint employment and franchising. Another example is the advisory opinions that will come from the FCC in the wake of the net neutrality rule. Similarly, FAA's 624-page, highly restrictive drone rule should have been a law from Congress. But in it, I count at least 6 areas where the agency intends issuing new guidance in this frontier sector rather than formal rulemakings. So while I may do the annual 10,000 Commandments compilation of countable trends in regulation, I suspect that unknown and unknowable aspects of the regulatory enterprise increasingly outweigh the known. I know the two sides will argue. Nobody sees the same rainbow, and nobody sees the same cost and benefit of every regulation or guidance. I would go further than the bills in play now, but still, surely we might agree that sometimes so-called market failures might be rooted in long-standing political failures, or that coercive top-down regulation isn't always the answer, especially if dark matter swamps normal rules or laws. Most importantly, I hope we can agree that not everything under the sun has to be turned into a public policy question or a regulatory agency. Think of it this way. The things we purport to regulate, safety, public health, financial stability, privacy, and so on, are not just dependent variables to be determined here in Washington. They're forms of wealth, and you need competitive disciplines, not just bureaucratic ones, to expand them rather than undermine them. So talk to your bosses about vehicles like the Regulatory Accountability Act. If you have issues with it, recognize that it's a compilation of several bills that can and will change. Look at things you can do together, as Republicans and Democrats did in the 1990s with the passage of the Unfunded Mandates Act and small business regulatory relief. Indeed, the Congressional Review Act itself, as Heritage noted recently, was highly praised by Harry Reid and then Senator Carl Levin. Legislatively, adopt things that have bipartisan pedigree. Trump's moratorium echoes a memorandum from the Obama administration, but it covers guidance besides. Trump promised 2 rules out for everyone in. You may not realize that Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat, in 2010 in the Washington Post proposed a similar idea, which in a sense amounts to a regulatory cost freeze. Other steps include implementing the Bipartisan Regulatory Improvement Commission and boosting resources at the OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs to do regulatory review. So you have lots of options. As we like to say, when it comes to prosperity, you don't have to tell the grass to grow, you just have to take the rocks off of it. My optimism stems from knowing there will always be an America. I just want it to stay here. Thank you very much.
I was looking at that cord thinking I'm going to go call up my old law firm colleagues and have them send the ambulance over when I trip and injure myself. No. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of CEI's work. As a lawyer, I was always glad to collaborate with CEI. And I'm also glad to be on a panel among friends and colleagues that I admire. The regulatory reform debate has obviously become very political, especially in the last year, as regulation has become more political. And in the debates about reg reform, oftentimes we see the same examples of regulation being cited as the administrative state gone overboard. The Clean Air Act, or sorry, the EPA's Clean Power Plan, the FCC's Open Internet Order, the Net Neutrality Order, the EPA and Army Corps' Waters of the United States rule to expand federal jurisdiction over land and water. And these three rules do have a lot of things in common. They are very expansive increases in government power and regulatory power. They're also all promulgated under pretty antiquated statutes. Right? The Clean Power Plan was promulgated under the Clean Air Act of 1970 and 1990. The Waters of the United States rule is the Clean Water Act of, 1972. And my favorite, the Open Internet Order is promulgated under the Communications Act of 1934 and the Telecom Act of 96. And that's where we are right now. The Telecom Act of 96 is more than 20 years old. It's a modern regulatory statute, relatively speaking. They have all of that in common, but something else to keep in mind. All of those major regulatory actions were promulgated through what we call informal rulemaking, notice and comment. Agency publishes notice of a rule, it takes comments, and it finalizes the rule. Or, let's be more candid, the agency decides basically what it wants to do, invites everybody to comment on it, and then still goes ahead and does what it basically wanted to do in the first place. It's sort of strange credulity to say that things like the Clean Power Plan are the stuff of informal rulemaking, right? Just intuitively, it should make sense that there should be more than just an informal process to so dramatically expand federal regulatory authority. So some friends of mine, colleagues, we put together a book. There are free copies of it outside. It's part of a series published by National Affairs. It's called Policy Reforms for an Accountable Administrative State. It's a short book in which we try to diagnose the problem of modern administrative governance and then find ways to make the administrative state more accountable to all three branches, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the first branch, Congress. Our point is that all three branches need to reevaluate the ways in which they limit or fail to limit modern administration. It's not a problem that belongs to one branch, it's a problem that belongs to all three. In the last chapter of the book, I try to offer some reforms on the main subject we have here today, administrative law. The procedures that govern the way that agencies make policy, make regulation, and the ways in which the courts review the agency's actions. The core proposal, the core reform we advocate at the end of this book is more or less the Regulatory Accountability Act. And by that, I mean not so much the omnibus version of it that was legislated this year, but I mean the core set of procedural improvements, new procedural requirements that agencies would need to go through when formulating the most high-impact, costliest rules, right? Rules costing, say, $1 billion a year in annual costs. For that subset of rules, whatever number you put on it, but for that subset of rules, the costliest, most burdensome rules, there simply needs to be more process. Agencies should be required to put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to give people an extra bite at the apple. There needs to be something akin to a hearing in which it's not just papers being filed at the agency, but an opportunity for critics to challenge either the factual or legal assertions of the agency personnel. We don't get into too many specifics of what that has to look like because we're not wedded to any one model. All we're saying is there needs to be something more than mere notice and comment rulemaking, this kabuki dance that we're all familiar with, before the agencies promulgate the most burdensome rules. Now, the usual response to that proposal is that if you burden agencies too much, they're just going to evade the process altogether. They won't go through rulemaking. They'll go through agency adjudication processes, they'll issue guidance documents, but they say it's a paradox. If you put too many restrictions on the agency, then the agency won't go through the process at all. And so that leads us to our second proposal. We encourage Congress to use Chevron deference as an incentive to get agencies to go through the right process. And what I mean by that is we urge that Congress pass legislation to prohibit Chevron deference for statutory interpretations that come out of anything other than the rulemaking process. So if an agency goes through adjudication instead of rulemaking, their statutory interpretations don't get deference from the courts. If they use guidance documents, they don't get deference from the courts. right now, the debate over Chevron deference, which I'm glossing over now, but we can discuss more if you'd like, is an all or nothing debate. It's a debate on whether there should be Chevron deference, the court should defer to the agencies, or should we get rid of it altogether? And we're trying to urge a middle ground here. It's not an all or nothing debate, but Chevron deference should be used as a carrot, as an incentive to get the agency to do the right thing up front in going through more process. So an agency gets a choice. Either they go through the trouble of notice and comment of real rulemaking process, especially for the costliest rules, and then the Chevron framework is still out there, so the courts are more deferential. Or they can just go through the adjudication process or guidance documents, knowing that when these things get up to judicial review, the courts are going to do de novo judicial review. They're going to scrutinize the agency's work and legal interpretations more rigorously. There are other proposals, miscellaneous proposals in our chapter about judicial review that I won't get into now. Those are really the two key points: improve the process up front and improve the process in judicial review. But make sure that you keep in mind that those two considerations are connected. There's this balance between ex ante procedures and ex post judicial review. And to be honest, that is in part what I think people sense is wrong with the current state of affairs. Agencies can make regulations far too easily, and then those regulations, those statutory interpretations, they don't get nearly enough rigorous judicial review on the back end. But the thing is, that's also the approach that the framers of modern administrative law took when they passed the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. And again, the APA of 1946. We're talking about a statute that is 70 years old now. It's time to be modernized. But the framers, when they passed that law, they looked at the administrative state as it actually existed at the time. They grappled with its realities, and they tried to map rules onto that administrative reality that they thought would have the right practical effect. And that's the approach that we take in this book. I mean, we all have regulations that we don't like, of course, but none of us, Orrin Cass, Kevin Kosar, and I, we aren't advocating for the administrative state to be torn down. We just want it to be more accountable. In the same spirit, we think, that the original APA framers approached their task. Again, not in the interest of stopping everything, but in the interest of making it more accountable in light of administrative reality as it actually existed. Thank you again for having me today. I'll let Dick sneak through first, and then I'll come back. And I should add, by the way, that I used Professor Pierce's casebook in my class, so now I'm going to find out everything I got wrong and don't tell my students.
Well, and I need the royalties desperately, so I appreciate that. So as you go through the really important task of reforming regulation, I would urge you to build on the excellent foundation that President Reagan provided when he issued Executive Order 12291. So that order does a lot of different things. First, it tells every executive branch agency that the agency must subject every major rule to cost-benefit analysis. Then it tells the agency that it can't issue a rule unless it concludes that the benefits exceed the costs. Then it goes on and tells the agency that when it's choosing among alternative methods of regulation, it must choose the alternative that maximizes the net benefits to society. Then it instructs agencies to review their existing rules and to identify, amend, or repeal any rule that it finds that is already in existence where the rule imposes costs that exceed its benefits. Executive Order 12291 then takes the next logical step and confers upon the Office of Management and Budget, specifically the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB, both the authority and the responsibility to ensure that all executive branch agencies comply with Executive Order 12291. Now, I would urge you to build on that very strong foundation in three ways. First, I would urge you to extend the scope of the OIRA review and all the other requirements of 12291 to independent agencies. There's simply no justification for the SEC or any other independent agency to be able to issue a rule that imposes costs that exceed their benefits. Right now, they're free to do that. If you just authorize the extension of OIRA review and the other requirements of 12291 to independent agencies, we will stop the practice of independent agencies issuing rules that impose burdens that exceed their costs. Second, I would urge you, and a lot of this has to be done in conjunction with Congressman Mulvaney in his new job running OMB. But the next thing I would urge you to do is to increase the efficacy of the provision of Order 12291 that requires agencies to review their existing rules to identify any that are unduly burdensome or obsolete, and then to amend or repeal them. So I think the way to do that most effectively would be for OIRA, OMB, to encourage regulated firms to come to OIRA with identification of any existing rule that the firm believes to be obsolete or unduly burdensome, to impose costs that exceed its benefits, along with some support for that, that belief, and then empowering OIRA to review that submission and determine whether the rule is obsolete or unduly burdensome. And if the OIRA agrees with the firm or firms that nominated the rule, then OIRA would have the power to instruct that agency to amend or repeal the rule so that we don't have existing rules that impose costs that exceed their benefits. And then the third thing I would urge you to do is to increase significantly the staffing and other resources available to OIRA. For at least the last several years, OIRA has been way short of the personnel and funding and other resources necessary to perform its existing functions. It needs to be beefed up not only to allow it to perform its existing functions effectively, but also to perform the expanded functions that I urge you to empower it to undertake. Now, I have studied in great detail each of the bills, regulatory reform bills, that is now pending in the Senate, or in a couple of cases still pending in the House. I oppose all of them. I think they are based on just serious misunderstandings of how the rulemaking process works. I think they would have horrible effects. I provide a summary of my reasons for having those views in the document that I provided each of you. And if anybody's interested in a more detailed explanation of why I think they're incredibly misguided, I'd be glad to provide that either in the question and answer part of this program or at any later date that you choose. Thank you. We might need OSHA to take a look at that.
You could sue.
Yeah, right.
I'm not sure, perhaps the architect of the Capitol might give us an exemption. I'm not sure if all of us apply up here. Jerry Ellig, please bring forth more wisdom for us. And don't trip. And don't trip.
Could you prioritize those? Well, thanks, Ken, for the introduction. Thanks, Annie, for the invite to be here and talk about this. It's a challenge to be the fourth person on a panel like this, to try to figure out what to say that isn't repetitious. And so what I decided to do is I'm going to give you a Calvinist approach to regulatory reform. One of my favorite Calvin and Hobbes cartoons. Calvin is filling up a water balloon, and he says, I'm going to prove there is no universal moral law governing the universe. I will throw this water balloon at Susie Durkins unless the universe gives me a sign that this would be wrong. He counts down, no sign. He throws the balloon at her, she gets wet, she chases him, beats him up. In the last panel, he's lying on the ground and he says, "Why does the universe always give you the sign after you do it?" And that's a fundamental principle we ought to keep in mind when we think about regulatory reform. As we are looking at this regulatory reform buffet spread in front of us, bills and some items actually passed by the House and possible executive actions and ways to change agency budgets and all kinds of things, I want to talk a little bit about some principles that we ought to keep in mind in order to pick and choose carefully among those things. I mean, the implication of Calvin's little adventure is, yeah, when you're going to regulate and tell people what they can and can't do, what they may and must do, and try to address important goals like keeping the air clean, keeping the water clean, keeping people safe, keeping us safe from financial fraudsters, you need to be able to answer some fundamental questions based on evidence in order to know whether you're making decisions that actually advance that, whether the decision maker is Congress writing a regulatory statute or a regulatory agency implementing a regulation. Certain basic fundamental things like, is there a significant problem that's likely to persist? If so, what caused the problem? What alternative solutions are there that actually address the root cause of the problem? What are the likely benefits and costs of each alternative? What outcomes do we expect to achieve as a result of this policy for citizens? What concrete outcomes are we trying to produce? And how will we know if it was a success or not, if it actually produced the outcomes and at what cost? Now, I don't think these questions are unique to regulation. I mean, we've done a lot of work at the Mercatus Center in the past also on performance management and government budgeting, where these kinds of questions are also really important. And I hope these questions aren't controversial. Whether you're trying to adopt a regulation that advances a liberal goal or a conservative goal, it'd be a pretty good idea to have evidence answering these questions before you make your decisions. And yet frequently, decision makers don't have that evidence. And if you want to know what evidence supports that claim, you can email me at jellig@mercatus.gmu.edu, and I would be happy to give you links to the research that demonstrates that decisions are often made in ignorance of these basic pieces of knowledge. So, how would we start thinking about regulatory reforms that help ensure that decisions are made after these questions are answered with evidence? Well, I'm going to start with Congress, not with the regulatory agencies. I took a look at a sample of economically significant regulations, which are the really big ones, that do things that regulations normally do. They have mandates or prohibitions. In other words, not budget regulations like Medicare reimbursement regulations. Economically significant regulations proposed between 2008 and 2013. That's 130 of them, so it's a pretty decent sample. In about half of those cases, the statute required the agency to issue a new regulation. So Congress made that decision, which means in about half the cases, Congress left that decision to the agency. For about 80% of those regulations, Congress decided what form the regulation should take, such as a disclosure rule or a performance standard or a technology standard. So most of the time, Congress dictates the form of the regulation, even if it lets the agency decide whether a regulation is necessary. Most of the time, Congress lets agencies make some pretty significant decisions about how stringent the regulation will be. And in about 40% of the cases, Congress pretty well decides who will be covered by the regulation. And in the remaining cases, the agencies have a decent amount, at least some discretion, trying to figure out who is covered. So Congress frequently makes regulatory decisions, but Congress by no means always makes the regulatory decisions. So Congress and agencies both need to be asking and answering the kinds of questions I mentioned. Unlike agencies, Congress has no real analytical arm or capability to get the answers to those questions before it writes regulatory statutes or when it reauthorizes regulatory statutes. And some folks have proposed that Congress take an even bigger role in either disapproving regulations under the CRA or approving new regulations under the REINS Act. I think really what needs to come first is Congress having its own analytical arm to answer those kinds of questions for it as either part of CBO or Government Accountability Office. Okay, now we move to the regulatory agencies. And as Dick described, there is a reasonably good system that tries to get agencies to answer these questions. But I've found through reading tons of regulatory impact analyses over the past 5 or 6 years that they are often very seriously complete and don't answer some of those important questions. The fundamental reason is because the OIRA, having OIRA review regulations is a good thing and it makes a positive difference, but the enforcement mechanism is pretty weak because it's an administration reviewing regulations proposed by people in the same administration. And so I think probably what we need to do is have a stronger enforcement mechanism, namely by writing requirements that agencies answer these questions, requirements for regulatory impact analysis, into statute so that it's not just a good idea from OMB, but it's the law, specifying the topics that need to be covered, like, you know, what's the nature of the problem, what caused the problem, what are the alternatives, and what are the benefits and the costs of the alternatives. And agencies ought to be required to use the best available evidence to answer those questions. And then, to have a stronger and credible enforcement mechanism, courts ought to have a limited but well-defined ability to look at the quality of an agency's analysis when an error or an omission may have a material impact on the decision the agency's made about the regulation. So we don't want to open the door to like nitpicking every darn thing in the regulatory impact analysis. That'd be a disaster. But what we should be doing is at least make it possible for courts to look at the quality of an agency's analysis when there is a contention that something really important in the analysis is missing or wrong or not based on the best available evidence, and that could have led to a materially different regulation if the agency had looked at this kind of thing. And I can talk about more detailed ideas like that in the Q&A. And finally, we need some type of a stronger requirement for retrospective analysis of regulations after they've been already adopted to find out whether they are actually working or not. You know, there's this old vaudeville joke, do you smoke after sex? I don't know, I never checked. That's one of the problems with regulation that scholars of all stripes agree on who've looked at it is that nobody checks, or it's rare that agencies go back and check. I mean, there's a report from the Administrative Conference of the United States that concluded this, for example. So we need a better focus on a retrospective evaluation of regulations to figure out what actually happened as a result of regulation, and are those results desirable and everything's fine, or does the regulation need to be changed, or is it completely ineffective and something else needs to be done? And there are various mechanisms in regulatory reform bills that would do that. And I want to mention, as a final thought, that probably one of the biggest effects of some kind of regulatory budget is not necessarily to limit new regulation, but that it provides an incentive and motivation to go back and look at old regulations, to find the ones that aren't working, to find the ones that aren't effective, in order to make room for the new ones that folks want to adopt. And with that, I'll shut up and we can move on to Q&A.